Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm here with Dylan at Rovers North. Today we're going to do a Terrafirma +2 suspension onto Dylan's Discovery 2. At the same time, we're also going to put some Dakar rims and some BF Goodrich commercial all-terrains on the truck. This is something that Dylan's been looking forward to for a while, and we're going to have him in the shop today just kind of assisting. So that he can learn a little bit more about his rig, and at the end of the day we should have a kind of tweaked and lifted up a little bit Discovery 2 that will look good, and we'll have some new rims and tires on it, and we hope Dylan's really happy with it. We're doing this procedure today on a lift, and you'll find that you can do it at home with jack stands, but for our convenience purposes and professional ease, we're going to use the vehicle lift. The first thing you want to do when you get the truck up on the lift is make sure all your lifting points are good and that the vehicle's ready to go up in the air. And also, because it's a Discovery 2 with alloy wheel nuts, you want to break the tension on the wheel nuts by hand before you lift the vehicle off the ground so that you don't have to impact the wheel nuts. Another thing that you need to do while the vehicle's on the ground, just for ease, is to remove your mass airflow and plastic intake assembly and release your coolant reservoir so that we can get to the shock top bolts for the front suspension. This is Dylan. Dylan, do you have anything to say about your truck today?
I'm just really excited for this.
Okay, the first move once you have the disco on the lift is to open up the bonnet, and to save a little bit of time you can start releasing the top of the shocks now. And on disco 2, that's just going to involve moving your mass airflow sensor out of the way and popping your coolant reservoir loose so you can undo those top 2 shock tower mounting bolts.
Now your bolt's probably going to get pretty tight to whatever it's backing up against as you bring it out more, so you're just going to have to, right when you get it out of the threads, you're just going to have to push it.
It's advantageous to remove these while the vehicle's still on the deck, and at the same time it's also easier to remove your rear 2 shock tower retaining bolts because you won't have access to them from the wheel arch side when you have the vehicle in the sky. So we've just removed the 2 inner shock tower nuts, and we've also done it on the driver's side, and now we're ready to put the vehicle up in the air.
Now that we're really tension, we're going to use the impactor to take out the rest of the wheel nuts off.
What we're doing now is just putting some penetrant on all of the nuts and bolts that we anticipate having to touch. In southern climates you don't really have to use this as much, but in Vermont we have lots of corrosion, so we always use lots of PB Blaster. And once you put it on, just allow it to set in for 5 or 10 minutes, and it will make removing the nuts a lot less painful. Okay, Dylan just finished removing the closest to us shock tower retaining nuts, and I've just removed the sway bar top link, and all this is going to allow the suspension to fall down as much as it needs to for us to be able to get the assemblies out. We've just removed our front yoke for our prop shaft, and we do that to allow the axle to articulate downwards further. And in this scenario, it's going to be limited by this center cross member.
So generally what we do is install the suspension, and then once we have the vehicle back on the ground, we get this angle right, and then we put the front yoke of the prop shaft back on. Sometimes it's easier to remove the prop shaft than to remove the center cross member on a disco tube, because these bolts and nuts have a tendency to seize in place, and a couple of ours are seized up. So in this scenario, in the interest of time, we're just gonna remove the front prop shaft attachment, which we've just done. You can see how the axle is rotated down enough to where now there's slack on our coil springs, and we'll be able to release the bottom of them and pull out the whole assembly and then put our new assembly in place. Okay, so now Dylan's removing the lower shock attachment that attaches the shock and spring assembly seat to the axle. And so once he does this, we'll be free to pull both these assemblies right out. So now we've removed the two bottom attachments for the shock. We've just kind of lifted it and rotated it out, and we're going to pull out the assemblies. Yeah.
How did he just do that?
The next thing we're going to do is lower the truck down and pull these shock towers out through the top, because it's just a little bit easier than fighting the inner wheel arch. So we're going to set the new tower assemblies down into the vehicle, and again, you want to go through the engine bay and just try and be as gentle as you can so that you don't scratch the finish. The inner wheel arch is a little proud, and it's going to want to touch our shock tower. So what we're going to do is start the shock tower retaining ring, start fastening that, and then what that'll do is just kind of make a few little, just slightly recontour that inner lip of the inner wheel well. It's not worth cutting or hitting the inner wheel well. We're just going to let the tension of the nuts center this down and pull it down on top. Spring retaining, shock tower retaining brackets right now, and we're just going to start all of the fasteners. And you can see this tension stored on the shock tower right now, and once we reef it down, it's going to be nice and flat, and it won't store that energy. We're about to put in our new spring and shock assemblies. The important thing to look for in Discovery 2 is that one top of the spring is flat and one bottom of the spring is not. The one that is not flat goes on the bottom. There's a special receiver in your spring retaining plate to take the bottom of the spring. And this is different. This is an identifying unique characteristic of Discovery 2 and P38 that is not going to be found on your Range Rover Classic or Defender or Discovery 1 springs. So if you've done those type of suspensions before, in this scenario you need to pay attention to this feature. And the thing that's going to throw you off is the stamping on the spring is always going to end up upside down, and you're going to say, geez, I should probably put it in like this so that the stamping is right, but actually you got to put it so that this spring coil wrap right here is pointing downwards. Then you're going to slide your new shock inside of it and try to, as gently as you can, put the assemblies up in place without scratching your nice new paint off. Sometimes this is easier said than done. And if you get frustrated with it or it's not going into place for you, just pull everything back out, reevaluate it for a second, and then you can go in and finish the install. But if you get frustrated, you're definitely going to scratch a lot of paint off. See, now once we have this located in the spring seat, we want to move this around so that this lip of the coil goes into this little retainer right here. And we'll show you more about that when we actually attach them. Okay, so you can see here now that we have more space between the axle seat and the top mounting point of the spring, so that basically our shock and our spring are in here floating, and obviously we need to put some stress on it and some leverage to compress it enough to where we can get these lower retaining bolts in and then our top retaining bolt up top. So the easiest way to do that is to use the axle stand, and we're just going to exert some weight on it and compress everything a little bit so that we can fasten it down. Because of the high level of corrosion where we live, I like to use lots of anti-seize just in case you ever have to go back in there. You can basically just wipe the stick on the bottom of the bolt, and that'll keep it from seizing up in place once you install it, and we'll make it so you can remove it in the future if you need to. Where's that last one? Take that one and that one. It's just like a copper paper.
Okay.
So our method here has been to lift up the axle and bring it towards the vehicle, and that allows enough compression to where we can start these lower two retaining bolts, which we have started, and then we're going to move over to this side. Okay, so if you're having trouble aligning the shock, spring plate, and receiving nuts, something you can do is take a punch and use your punch to identify the holes. Easier said than done sometimes. And then you know that right now we have those three mounting surfaces aligned. Gently pull out your punch, put your bolt back in. You've got a pretty good chance of being able to start it down in there. There we go. We've secured our lower shock mounting points, so now the assemblies can't fall out. The next move here is to lower the vehicle down and put upward pressure on the axle. And the things we're shooting for when we do that are to locate these sway bar mounting links back up into the sway bar, and also compress the shock and align the shock all at once so that it slides up into its top mounting position. And at that point we'll secure it. The front will essentially be done except for reattaching the front prop shaft, which we're not going to do because we actually have to change out this prop shaft because the one that we're running right now is defective. So we decided to do the suspension and renew the prop shaft all in one operation. So what we're going to do now is lower it down. Let's make sure you guys are clear of it. I like to use blocks because they're soft and they won't hurt the axle, and they'll also provide enough resistance to push the axle up as we bring the lift down. And Dylan, what you're going to need to make sure of on your side is that this shock goes up into this housing right here, aligned so that we can stick the bolt through. And then you're also going to just have to keep an eye on your sway bar link right here, but I have those pretty well lined up. So your sway bar link, you want to go up into that hole, okay? And we're gonna lower it really slowly so that if your fingers are in there, they don't get super pinched out. What's that, buddy? We're going to start removing the rear suspension. The easiest way to start this operation is to remove your top and lower shock bolts. Like I said, use lots of PB Blaster because sometimes they don't want to come out of their little home in there. Removing our bottom spring mounting plates. This is pretty much the same operation on the front. On the Discovery 2, the receiver is threaded and welded into the bottom of the plate, so all you really have to do is manipulate the top of the fastener. Now we're going to just weasel the existing shocks out and the existing springs. In this scenario, you can see that there's a fair amount of stress on your brake lines, and there's also a lot of stress stored in your sway bar. So in this part of the operation, it's important to move fast because these lines are very strong, but you don't want to have the weight of the axle on them for too long. But you do need to have some stress on them to be able to pull and have enough space to put the new assemblies in place. We've released some tension from the brake line mount, and I'm also think it's going to be helpful to remove our sway bar attachments here. We just want the axle to droop down a little bit more, and if that doesn't do it, then we'll release these rear sway bar links as well. But to start off with, let's see if we can get away with just doing I'm sorry, that's not a rear sway bar link, that's the rear third link, and we're going to attach the sway bar now. Okay, so we've released this sway bar link just enough to take the stress out. We've set our spring and dampener assembly back in place. I like to reuse these because they're made out of rubber and they help dampen out the harshness. And now the maneuver is to reinsert the spring plate. And it's often easier to put the assembly in, put the coil in, and then weasel the spring plate in from the bottom after you've done that. Now what we can do is set this side's shock up in place. And what we usually find is that it's best to compress the shock and just put in one of the mounting points. And then as we articulate the vehicle more and push the suspension back up, we will be able to put in the other mounting point. So we've lifted up with an axle stand, lifted the axle back up from full articulation, and we're doing that so that it's easier to align the mounting points for the top of the shock. Because when the suspension is fully maxed out, it has a tendency to exert force like this on the shock, and if you just compress everything a little bit more, it'll be easier to align it, and you'll be able to set these top pins in place. So now that we've gotten our springs and coils in, we're just going to put this bracket back in place before we remove the axle stand. Okay, so we've got the coil, spring back in place, we've tightened up our sway bar, we've put our bottom spring retaining plate back in. We're just going to wipe our fingerprints off of everything and just feel and make sure that all of our connections are tight like we found them. Okay, so we're putting our new wheels and tires on, and we're just taking the opportunity to put a little copper anti-seize on the inside of our wheel nuts. And I put on the inside instead of the thread, because when you put it on the thread, it has a tendency after you drive to migrate out and stain your new wheels. So it's always pretty easy to just take the brush and dab a very small amount just on the inside of your threads, and that will stay in there as you put the nut on, and ideally it won't splatter all over your wheels. Easiest way to not scratch the rim is to do almost all of it by hand and take a lot of care to make sure that the socket doesn't touch the rim. And you never really want to impact a Land Rover wheel nut. If you've worked on Land Rovers before, you'll already know that, but if you never really want to impact these Disco 2 or Discovery 1 or Range Rover Classic wheel nuts, because you'll screw up the party wrapping and this will separate from the wheel nut, and it will also corrode, so it's very important to not use an impactor on these. So now we're going to put the vehicle back on the ground, and before we do anything, we're going to put enough weight on the axle to keep these road wheels from spinning, and then we're going to go around and torque them all down. Now if you ever take a wheel off of the Rover in the course of service, you need to make double extra sure that you torque it down, because you know, if you leave a shock a little bit loose or leave a shock tower a little bit loose, that's one thing, but you don't ever want the experience of your wheel coming off while you're traveling down the road at speed. So it's just very important to make sure that you torque down your wheel nuts. And
We like to torque ours to 95 foot-pounds. Okay, we've just finished putting Dylan's suspension lift on his Discovery 2. We did Terrafirma 2-inch lift kit and took the opportunity at the same time to put on new wheels and tires for him. The truck's all set. We're pretty happy with the way it's sitting, and we're going to cut him loose to go do some testing and see how the end user likes it.